Welcome everybody to a new year, a new Fireside Chat series. I'm Rita McGrath. I'm with Columbia Business School, as most of you who are here probably know. And my guests this week are Jeff Abbott and Chris Ye, entrepreneurs extraordinaire, good friends, people that I admire and look up to. Chris certainly has been the co-author of a couple of books that have influenced me enormously. One is The Alliance, about our new world of careers, and I use the phrase tour of duty career all the time, so I'll acknowledge Chris for that. And then Blitzscaling more recently, how to really grow a massively important company. And the two of them have embarked on a new venture with the Global Scaling Academy. So I hope that we will get to talk about those things. But before we get to that, I think it would be remiss if we didn't spend a little bit of time on this current moment. This is January 8th. And that's 2 days after January 6th, 2021, which I think is a day that a lot of us were brought sharply into the present moment. And I'll start with you, Jeff, because you just came back from Copenhagen, right? You were on lockdown in Europe for how long?
11 months. Yeah, I went over on a 3-month project due to the coronavirus, ended up hunkering down and waited for just this precise moment to launch back to the United States and land in Arizona. And to my amazement, the news feed that greeted me as I stepped out of the airplane was that of insurrection at the Capitol and surging coronavirus. Just extraordinary.
Perfect time to come back to this country, Jeff.
I picked the perfect moment, indeed.
So what did that feel like, getting off the plane amidst all that?
You know, I have to say I've spent more than half my adult life and career outside of the United States. And so I'm well acquainted with, you know, what we would call the stereotypical anti-Americanism or the normal things that one is greeted with. But this time around, it's very clear everywhere and across Europe, and from what one hears, that the reputation of the United States is severely tarnished, and people are disappointed and shocked and almost dismissive now of what's coming out of our country in many ways. And sadly, a lot of it has to do with the just reprehensible moral example that has been put forth over the last 4 years. And of course, the events of January 6th just served to underline everyone's worst suspicions that what we were lurching forward, that nobody believed was possible, was in fact lurking there the whole time. And it's beyond shocking and disappointing.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'll add to that is it is horrifying, unprecedented, all those different words that we need to use. But I'm always a silver linings kind of guy. And the silver lining is that I feel like this has really ripped the mask off of what the Trump administration was really about. And we are seeing a significant repudiation of that administration, various cabinet secretaries resigning. We could argue that that is in part because it prevents them from having to weigh in on the 25th Amendment, but nonetheless, they are resigning. There are many denouncements by senators and other major political figures from the president's own party, the Republican Party. And I think there's just widespread condemnation. Yes, he has supporters who cheer the events and continue to support them, but they're increasingly a smaller and smaller minority. And there is no way for them to argue with folks who are not true believers themselves that the president has the best interests of America at heart. So in some sense, I feel like the events are terrible and tragic, and will go down in history and be a moment of shame, especially for those who perpetrated them. But I feel like they will help the country make a break with Trumpism, and especially help the Republican Party make a break with Trumpism.
So one of the things I've been looking at in my own work on strategic inflection points is, you know, those moments when you really reach a tipping point and what happens sort of after that. And one of the scenarios I've been talking about now, probably for about the last 6 months, is what I call echoing FDR, you know, the rendezvous with destiny moment, where back in the Depression, you know, Roosevelt basically said that if we want to have a healthy society, that we need to have a fair sort of allocation of resources. And it's something I'm very passionate about. And I wonder if one of the silver linings indeed to come out of this is a renewed sense that, while I cannot endorse the way this erupted, the underlying sources of a lot of this discontent have not been adequately dealt with. And perhaps that's something we can take going forward. So perhaps it would be a neat idea for the two of you to just lay out some of your background, because you've both got really fascinating entrepreneurial roots. And Chris, in particular, I'd love to hear how you got into the mode of writing The Alliance, because I think it's a fascinating book. To me, it just crystallizes a lot of what we're thinking about in terms of careers and the choices people are making about how they're going to spend their lives. And I'll let you take it from here, and then I'll chip in if people don't understand what the core concept of the book is.
Perfect. So I'll cover sort of the history and what led up to it and some of the core ideas of the book, and try to keep it relatively short. So instead of lecturing, which I'm all too used to doing, we're able to have a full conversation. But being an author, which, as you know, has its major upsides and major downsides. But being an author, being a writer is something that I have wanted to do since I was a child. I was always a big reader. I was a participant in those March of Dimes contests where you read books. And while I
forgot about those. Oh my God. Yeah, absolutely.
Now, I set records for the number of books I was able to read in that month, but unfortunately, my reputation preceded me, so nobody would actually provide a donation that was based on the number of books. They all opted for the fixed amount donation. So even though I was able to, I think in my top month when I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, read 114 books in a month, I only raised a small amount of money for charity. But again, loved reading books. And of course, once you start reading so much, you start thinking to yourself, well, maybe I could do this too. So all the time as I was growing up, I always thought about being a writer. Now, what I did once I got older and I was in high school is my mother was kind enough to buy me subscription to Writer's Magazine, and for me to begin to realize sort of what the actual profession looked like. And I very quickly decided, I actually don't like worrying about how I'm going to send out enough freelance proposals so I can get paid 2 cents a word and manage to live in a hovel somewhere. And so I said, well, maybe I won't necessarily go into this kind of life just now. But when I was at Stanford, in addition to studying product design engineering, I also studied creative writing, both fiction and poetry. And so I was still building my writing skills, and I wrote a lot of fiction and other things during that time, but went into the world of business because I felt like that was a place where I could have a lot of impact. And even as this was going on, even as I was in the world of business and going through business school and running companies, I was still writing on the side, first as a sort of freelance journalist. Probably, while it's not the most read, the funniest one to talk about is the time I was assigned to cover the first annual Cougar Convention, which happened to take place in Palo Alto. So it was a nationwide gathering of cougars and cubs that took place in Palo Alto, which I attended. And I believe you can still find the story I filed about it, and learned a lot that night, quite a lot. Anyways, so I was interested in writing this whole time, but I was looking for the right opportunity. And in 2011, my friends Reid Hoffman and Ben Casnocha put out a book called The Startup of You. And they actually brought me in as a consultant on the book because they knew I was a writer and had been writing thousands of blog posts, and was somebody who had a good head on his shoulders, and somebody who thought a lot about management and entrepreneurship. And so I helped them with that book as a consultant. And then they came back in 2012 after that book had been released and was successful and said, we'd like to work with you on something else. And I said, okay, great. Well, I just have one question. They're like, what's that? I said, is my name going to be on the cover of what we work on? And they said, yes. I'm like, okay, I'm in. I don't need to know anything else. And so that's how the Alliance came about. We started off saying, the ideas of the Startup of You are that everyone is like an entrepreneur these days. Even if you work in the corporate world, your career is your startup, and you have to view yourself as an entrepreneur. And the logical question to ask beyond that is, okay, if I'm a manager at a company or a leader at a company in this era, what is different? Because the way that we traditionally manage people does not take that into account. So the core notion of the Alliance is that we no longer live in a world where people are going to be at the same company for 20 years, or even in some cases 5 years. And so as a result, how do we build organizations that can accomplish great things? How do we build relationships that can last a lifetime given this reality? And as you referred to, the core idea of the book is this notion of the tour of duty. And what it means is that when people are working together as manager and employee or employer employee, it's an alliance relationship. And that means it's a relationship between equals who are coming into the relationship voluntarily. And the point of the alliance is to explicitly spell out what each party is bringing and what they're trying to accomplish, much like you would if you were the Secretary of State signing an alliance with a new ally. And the alliance gets funneled into a tour of duty, which is a particular mission that the employee is trying to accomplish. It might be launching a new office, it might be launching a new product, it might be expanding to a new geography, who knows? But that directionality, that really focus on a mission and the focus on being open and honest with each other about what they're getting out of the relationship is the thing which paradoxically, in a world where people are at companies for shorter and shorter periods of time, allows people to build longer term relationships and more loyalty. So that's how I ended up becoming an author. And I wrote The Alliance while I was still VP of marketing for a company. And then after that, The Alliance did very well. And then we wanted to work on more books. I was able to step back from being a primary operator and focus on being not quite a full-time writer, but certainly focused primarily on writing. And it's been a great run. But couldn't take the entrepreneur out of me, which is why I still work with great entrepreneurs like Jeff to launch new ventures like the Global Scaling Academy.
So one of the audiences I speak to a lot are learning and development people responsible for talent and human resources. And this notion of the alliance completely freaks them out, because a lot of the premises that much of our HR doctrine is based on are this sort of notion of careers as ladders and long-term relationships, and you plan, you have this career planning thing that you do 3 or 4 or 10 steps forward, and the alliance really flies in the face of a lot of that. And one of the more interesting aspects, I think, is that today the networks that we form, and you and I are part of the Silicon Guild, that's how we met, as I recall, which is a group of nonfiction authors that really try to support and nurture each other's endeavors. But one of the things I find most interesting is that our networks, irrespective of what organization we happen to be part of at any given point in time, tend to be more durable across those boundaries, which I think is just a really interesting idea for people to get their heads around. So, I know one of my recent MBA graduates was handed this project by her partners at a consulting firm, and she finished it in like record time. And they're like, "How did you do that?" And she said, "Oh, well, I have this network of friends, and one of them's a great design person, another one's a great statistician, another one." And she put together this like virtual network of people. And this is the interesting part, who work for competing organizations, and they all piled in to help her with her project. I mean, where in the HR manual does that stuff exist? I don't know.
Absolutely. And I think that there's a broader point here, which is because of the internet, and this is the thing that's really changed everything. Because of the internet, we're all connected by a global electronic network, right? We are able to be connected more than ever before. We're able to stay in touch with people more than ever before. We have things like social media to maintain relationships, which otherwise might have withered because people are on different continents or what have you. And that's reflected in the fact that this is what my co-author Reid Hoffman has dubbed the networked age. And what you just described is how the power of networks is now a part of our careers, a part of how we do work, a part of everything we do. And recognizing the power of the network and recognizing that we now live networked lives is a big part of being successful in this modern age.
Absolutely. So one of the questions one of our guests has asked is, what's the difference between writing and creative writing?
So excellent question. Again, in many ways, all writing is creative. But in the academic setting, creative writing is specifically used to focus on fiction and poetry. So, and arguably poetry is also in the fictional category. Interestingly enough, I studied all different types of writing when I was at Stanford. In addition to traditional creative writing and fiction writing, literary fiction writing, I also studied poetry. I also studied literary nonfiction, which, as it turns out, was a great preparation for my actual career, as well as experimental fiction. So I try to draw on all of these different experiences, and I think that they all fall under the classic category. It's stereotypical, but true, of storytelling, and being able to understand storytelling in all its forms is really powerful. But in that very specific narrow sense, creative writing refers to fiction and poetry.
That's great. So, Jeff, I don't want to leave you out here. And I know you've been entrepreneurial in a number of different settings, including in a university setting, which, ASU is an institution I just have the huge amount of regard for. Maybe share with us a little bit about your background and what you've done there.
Sure, thank you. Well, I grew up in Chicago and always knew that I wanted to work internationally. And like Chris, I had taken some creative writing classes in college, but I launched off on an international management program just before globalization was common, just before all MBA programs became global. And I attended Thunderbird School of Global Management because I was really hell-bent on getting overseas. And first that took me to become a visiting foreign professor at the ripe old age of 26 at the Tech of Monterrey, which is Mexico and Latin America's largest and one of the leading business schools. And it was a fantastic experience to kind of bridge the world of academia and business, because as I soon found out, a business school professor, even a 26-year-old one with only a master's degree, is someone held in incredibly high esteem. And I reached out for advice because, of course, I was really in over my head with 2 weeks to prepare for classes that had never been taught before. So I reached out.
We should mention you were teaching the classes in Spanish as well.
Yes.
What?
And at that time, because we were not yet in a networked age, when I visited the management section at the library, there were only 40 books in the category of management and marketing to draw upon. And there was no internet, no other place to get material. So I hopped on an airplane and flew back to Phoenix and went rather frantically, to be honest, knocking on all the doors of former professors and others that had never been my professors, and said, listen, I have this job. I have to teach a class that starts in 2 weeks, and they don't know what it's supposed to be about, and I really don't either. Can you help? And so anyway, I was able to pull together a lot of source material, and fortunately, when you teach something, you actually learn more than your students. Went on to have the most popular class at the university, and soon my syllabus had been adopted by the other 4 sections of professors who wanted to use it. But along the way, I made a wonderful relationship with someone who remains a friend to this day, Dr. Robert T. Moran, emeritus professor of Thunderbird, who, along with Philip R. Harris, were the authors of Managing Cultural Differences, a book that came out in the late 70s that was sort of the seminal work in cross-cultural management. And at that time, Bob was about my age now. And like Gary Hamel and many others at that time, C.K. Prahalad was jetting all over the world, consulting for major organizations like Toyota. And I invited him down to a symposium to address the 6,000 students of management who loved his book and wanted to meet him and hear from him. And he came down and, predictably amazed everyone with his insights. Because also in 1994, the border between the U.S. and Mexico was more than a figment of one's imagination. There were no information flows. And in fact, talking about the networked age, the books and the articles that I brought back that I had in my office were the only copies of them at that university. And the department head said to me, Jeff, I'd really like to have your books and articles in my office, because you work here for me and I want to have the department library. And I said, well, that's unacceptable to me because I come in earlier than you and I often review them and prepare for my classes, which start at 8. And it's inconvenient for me to have to, make an appointment with you in advance to have access to my own materials. But just to, lend some gravity to the importance of the internet, the networked age, the lengths that I had to go through in 1994 to access information, to retain access to information in order to teach a class, and how all of that has changed. And just a little plug for a book that's now 25 years old is during Robert Moran's visit, which also the symposium was also attended by then former President Ronald Reagan. I said, it's really shocking that Mexicans, Americans, and other, other managers in North America have so little understanding of one another. And here we are embarking on the North American Free Trade Agreement. I'd really like to contribute something to the conversation. and shed some light on management practices and, what it takes to be effective between the two. And he said, well, how would you like to write a book with me? He said, no, it doesn't mean I'm going to do all the work. I can help us get the contract, but in this case, you're going to do most of the work because, my work has already been done. And so we sketched out the table of contents on the back of a napkin over breakfast. And I ended up spending the next year working on a book that's called NAFTA, Managing the Cultural Differences, which was a small paperback meant to be a handbook for managers on the do's and don'ts of working effectively across borders and across cultures in North America. A book that went on to, be influential in the circles that we worked in, but was not a great commercial success. And but anyway, I think it serves to illustrate the point about the networked age, the importance of access to information. And jump forward 20 years after that, I found myself back at a university, at Arizona State University, running the entrepreneurship programs, specifically the acceleration programs and the curriculum for the largest university in the country, with 5 different programs and tens of thousands of online learners. And what a contrast that by that time, all of the best practices of Silicon Valley of starting companies had been codified and published and could be downloaded as a PDF. And my job was more an act of curation and filtering and assembling than the need to discover and digest and produce. And so in that capacity, I developed the first online curriculum and made that available to ASU and the broader community. And that's what really served as the launching point for beginning to work with Chris on taking some of those same learnings, both about entrepreneurship, about the nuts and bolts of building a business and curriculum, and trying to project that internationally to work with scaling founders in places of the world that still suffered from some of the same dearth of access and perhaps dearth of connectivity that I experienced 20 years earlier in my first stint in Mexico. And that's what 4 or 5 years later has morphed into the Global Scaling Academy, which is our effort to take the wonderful work of Chris and Reed and Ben, along with other work that's relevant, and make that available to a select group of scaling founders in communities around the world that may not have access either to the connectivity or to the content, and to put those two together in a way that hopefully can help catapult their ability to scale their business from wherever they are. And so I think that, is a good place to stop and kind of ties back everything.
Yeah, and so before we get into the whole notion of blitzscaling, which I think is a hugely important idea, so ASU President Michael Crow has talked about the 5th wave of universities, and that the first few waves of universities often were based on exclusion. So you got a higher selectivity ranking in the U.S. News report if you turned away more students, which has led, in my opinion, to this just awful, vicious cycle of, you go out and recruit as many applicants as you possibly can so you can turn away as many as you possibly can. I mean, it's insane. It's like, what society would design a system like that? And he's been very vocal about saying he wants ASU to be a different kind of university, one where it becomes a pathway to a better future for its students, and inclusion rather than exclusion, which I think is just fascinating. And so it's
so inspiring, and it was so inspiring to be a part of that. And in fact, as it relates to entrepreneurship, what he did was cast 1,000 seeds. He said to every department, every school, start your own courses. And he consciously sowed a decentralized approach and waited, to see what would grow. And so as a result, instead of a top-down approach, you have what you would exactly expect, which is an approach to entrepreneurship that fits the college or the subject area, whether it be humanities or medicine, and it's really been impactful.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting things they've tried, and I'm hoping to get him in here to talk about that, is getting rid of the departments. And I work in strategy, which by definition is an interdisciplinary field, right? You can't just say, well, today I'm finance and tomorrow I'm marketing and the day after that. No, you got to do it all at once. And it's been very difficult for strategy as a field to function in the context of the larger university because it is so interdisciplinary. Okay, so let's talk about photo op here, Blitzscaling. Really, really interesting book. A whole new way of growing a company, a whole new way of thinking about what a company is. And Chris, you make this fascinating sort of analogy between, when it's just you and your team, you're sort of a little team, then you're a tribe, then you're a city, then you're a nation. Maybe talk about some of the core principles in Blitzscaling. Then I'd like to link it back to what you're doing with the Academy.
Absolutely. So when we think about blitzscaling, again, it ties into that core insight that we lived in the networked age. And one of the implications of living in the networked age, where all of us are connected via supercomputers in our pockets and we can reach out to anyone, anywhere in the world instantaneously, is that more and more markets are subject to network effects and thus are winner take most markets. And in the book, we call them Glengarry, Glen Ross markets after the famed movie from the late 1980s, early 1990s, where they talk about first prize is a Cadillac, second prize is a set of steak knives, and third prize is you're fired. As I've increasingly gone out into the world, there are younger and younger audiences who haven't seen that movie. So I've recently added another one, which is the Ricky Bobby principle from Talladega Nights, a famous film with Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly, Sacha Baron Cohen. Anyways, the Ricky Bobby principle is if you ain't first, you're last. And that is precisely what we see in these winner take most markets. The company that achieves critical scale first triggers a series of competitive advantages that allow them to dominate the market for decades and basically just print money. And you can see that at work in the companies that are so successful today. If you look at companies that are the most valuable in the world, whether it is Apple or Microsoft or Google or Facebook or what have you, and now Tesla as well, as it's shouldering its way in, and Amazon and so on. These companies tend to have these kinds of characteristics. They are the big winner in a gigantic winner take most market. And that's what's allowed them to be so phenomenally successful, both financially and in terms of their impact on the world. So the notion of blitzscaling is, well, if the goal is to reach critical scale, then clearly what you need to do is you have to prioritize speed above everything else, because it's an all-out sprint. It's a race against everyone else who you're competing with. And whoever wins that race wins the big prize. And so look, blitzscaling is all about, well, how do I identify one of these winner-take-most markets? Because if you go after a non-winner-take-most market with the same strategy, you end up with WeWork. And then how do you manage to deal with the stresses of growth? Because growing and tripling in size every year for 10 years in a row is not normal. It's completely abnormal. Like nothing that we study. Obviously, you teach at Columbia, and I studied at Harvard Business School, and Jeff was an executive over at Arizona State. Nothing we teach in any of these schools says, yeah, here's how you deal with the issues of growing and tripling in size every year for 10 straight years. So that's what blitzscaling is all about. And as you described it, and reference, one of the key things that we talk about is the different stages of blitzscaling, which is we use the analogy of different units of human organization to emphasize just how much companies change as they grow. So we start off as a family where you can count the number of people in the organization on your hands, right? Less than 10 people. And
you're all around the kitchen table, right?
Exactly. You're around the kitchen table.
And what I think is fascinating about that, and I think it relates to the pandemic that we're in, right? Which is when you're all in that mode, information does not have to be thought about. It's in the air. You're all there. You just share it. Once you get out of that mode, though, you've got to be much more deliberate. And I think a lot of leaders are learning that in this pandemic, that, stuff that used to just happen, now they have to actually think about.
Yeah. And there's fascinating things that are going on as a result of the pandemic. So, for example, my friend Sarah Guo over at Greylock has invested in a company called Remotion, which provides the sort of always-on video chat for teams and companies. And it's a new company, a Series A investment, so very early on. But you can imagine if you're trying to run a family stage organization, that's exactly the kind of ambient awareness and constant always-on communication that you need. Now, if you're successful as a family, you move up to the next level, which is the tribe level, where now you're counting people in terms of tens. And you're still very informal, but you're starting to really figure things out. You're starting to have managers and things like that. The next level is the village stage, which is sort of the pivot point. Now you've got hundreds of people, and you have clear organization, formal organization and structures. And then beyond that, you have the city when you're into the thousands, or the nation when you're into tens of thousands. And the reason we draw these lines, which, as you know, nothing is ever quite so black and white. But the reason we draw these lines is to emphasize these things are completely different from each other. You don't run a family the same way you run a nation. There's no state of the family speech that happens. There's no two chambers of government at your family dinner. Well, maybe there is for you. I don't know. Perhaps I presume, but they're very different. And each time you go up one of these phases, one of these orders of magnitude, you have to realize you're probably going to have to refactor your entire organization and approach.
That's really interesting. So let's tie that now to what you guys are doing with the Global Scaling Academy, because new venture, right? Both experienced entrepreneurs. How have you approached this? What's its mission? How do people get involved with it?
So Jeff, this is Jeff's animating. This is Jeff's project. He is the leader. He's the one who conceived it. He came to me and said we should do this. So I'm going to let him go ahead and give the introduction, because he is responsible for the success we've had.
Great.
Well, it's really the next generation of what we've been doing for years. And so if you think about the objectives that we began with at ASU, how do we make curriculum, in this case, it was very simple early stage startup curriculum, available to many people. And here it's scaling. And so Chris and I had decided that we wanted to work with some of the top quality scaling entrepreneurs in the world. But the question is, how can you do that when they're spread all over the world? How can you be everywhere? And after 3 or 4 years of traversing the planet, running programs from Santiago, Chile to Doha to the Nordics, and Chris has been to Asia several times, you start to realize that it's simply impossible. And so I think we always had the notion that we had a need to build something more scalable than the typical workshops and speaking business. And so it was about a year ago, 4 months before the pandemic, that we settled on this idea of creating a community. And the idea was to create a peer-to-peer setting, be able to cross borders, and kind of going back to the example of Ashoka or Entrepreneurs Organization, be able to have peer learning take place when founders could meet one another and share experiences across geographies or across industries, and ultimately a place to plant the concept of blitzscaling and to convert that into tools and methodologies that could take the book. And it was really my passion. The first time I read the book, I said to Chris, this is a framework. And as a former educator of entrepreneurship, I would love to see this on a one-page canvas. I never heard anybody talking about scaling. And we've been to so many programs. And if you go to 10 cities in a row, you'll find entrepreneurs all working on the same business idea. And you look at it and you say, that can't scale. And you think, wow, there's 5 teams in every major city in the world working on that exact same problem right now. And none of those things can scale, except there's no measuring stick. There's no litmus test that allows an educator, advisor, or an investor in places that are less experienced in Silicon Valley to jump in and quickly assess that. And that's what I saw in Blitzscaling, was the making of tools that could help with that. And so one of the other things that I'm really proud that Chris and I and our other partner, Scott, have been able to work on is converting Blitzscaling into tools. And we've just now begun to put them to use inside the community. So as an example, a founder joins, the first thing we do is ask them to self-assess on the 7 variables described in the book. And then to dive a little deeper in, we begin to ask them for strategies they've contemplated to improve their performance in each area. And so this allows us to scale ourselves, puts tools in their hands that they can go back to their organization and canvas with, and then come back to us. And so the community is it's an online platform where our meetings occur, where our coaching sessions occur, and where members can share their learnings and strategies with one another. So it's a virtual community where blitzscaling is the central focus.
So what do you look for when you're looking for something that can scale? Because I teach in my past, I've taught entrepreneurship classes, and every so often, you'll go off to the Academy of Management or something, and all the entrepreneurship profs will get together and we'll talk about what's the dumbest idea that you've ever had presented to you in class, right? And my personal favorites have ranged from there was a guy that wanted to farm crocodiles. And he had this idea that he would farm these crocodiles in the Midwest where there were a lot of cattle ranches. And the thought was, well, the cattle ranches, the cows die. What do you do with them? And his thought was he would feed these cows to these crocodiles, and then he would eventually use the crocodiles to make leather goods. I mean, it was like it had a sort of a surface level kind of, well, oh, yeah, that's an interesting idea. But then when you think about how do you scale dead cows and crocodiles, I don't think that works, right? What are some of the things you look for when you're looking for a business that can scale?
Chris?
So if we take a look at the Blitzscaling framework, and this is taken from the book itself, but I think that there are some useful nuances we can add to it. There are a series of growth factors and growth limiters that we list off as being necessary for blitzscaling. And these are the things that mean that it makes sense to go ahead and pursue growth and speed ahead of everything else. And the key thing is some of these are necessary but insufficient, and others of them are essential. So the ones which are necessary but insufficient are the classic things we look for in every great business. So product market fit, as Steve Blank and Eric Ries have described, having a large, preferably global market, which is obviously something that's important if you want to achieve something of great scale, having high gross margins, because at the end of the day, even though people have talked about things like, oh, the new economy, I mean, we're old enough to remember when people said, oh, you don't need to make profits anymore. I'm like, no, that's not true. The purpose of business in the end is to make profits. So you need high gross margins, and then the ability to scale your organization and to scale your operations. These are all things that you need if pursuing all-out growth is going to be successful. But they don't distinguish you, because every great multi-billion-dollar company has to have all those things. So the two things that really cause an opportunity to stand out as being blitz scalable are, first and foremost, the winner-take-most market, which, as we've described, typically arises from network effects, but can also be a result of a land grab environment where if you lock in your customers or certain resources, you can dominate the market and essentially have a monopoly. And the other is having some sort of scalable distribution. And the reason the scalable distribution is so important, and again, this is often overlooked in the startup world. Everyone's talking about product, and product, absolutely essential. You have to have it. But distribution is even more important, because the effect we're talking about is an effect of scale. And to get to scale, you need distribution. And the better your distribution strategy, then the faster you can get to critical scale and the less money you have to spend to get there. And so for distribution, we're really looking for things like virality that is organic to the use of the product itself, incentivized virality. Many people probably are familiar with how everywhere from Dropbox to Uber offers incentives for referring other people. And then, of course, tapping into existing distribution networks. So having a product where you're able to tap into Microsoft Salesforce or tap into a distribution channel that is interested in spreading what you're doing. And if you have those things, those are the things that really set those blitzscaling opportunities apart. And it's that combination of the winner-take-most market and the ability to scale that says, okay, this is something where we should really put the pedal to the metal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the things that I've been sort of super interested in is this, I'll call it excess amounts of cash flowing into businesses that claim to be the Uber of fill in the blank, right? And I think they have in many cases, these investments have a real misunderstanding of the nature of winner-take-all markets or markets. And I'll just stick with Uber as a class in point. I mean, I was writing in 2015 about, like, guys, this is like AOL, Time Warner, like 20 years later, because it doesn't have genuine network effects, because it's, by definition, it's local, right? I mean,
correct.
There's so many drivers and only so many riders in a particular locality. And because it's a physical thing, it's not an information good. It's, by definition, the networks are limited. And so how do so many theoretically smart people put so much money into ideas that are just fundamentally flawed? What would your take be on that?
So my take is very simple, which is that Most people are positional rather than principled. And what I mean by that is they hold a basket of beliefs or positions, and they basically have this surface level thing of saying, oh, Uber works, therefore Uber for X will work, versus having a principle saying, well, what is the principle behind Uber? Well, the principle behind Uber is a combination of a two-sided marketplace that is managed, crowdsourcing, location-based services, et cetera, et cetera. So what are the principles that are coming together to make it happen? And I use Uber as an example of how people fail to think about the principles. So I take three different companies. So Uber, Airbnb, and Lime. So three companies that at the surface seem to have the same business model, which is to say that they are renting out some sort of a service, and it's on demand and it's generally accessed through your phone. And yet these three have radically different business results. With Airbnb, we have a company which before the pandemic was profitable and actually has recovered so quickly from the pandemic that it is profitable again, went public at an enormous value, and is more valuable than Uber. Then we have Uber, which is a company which is pioneering, certainly very successful in that sense, but struggling to turn a profit. And then we have companies like Bird or Lime, the bike or scooter rental places where, their greatest legacy they're likely to lead is giant piles of discarded hardware sitting around major cities. And so the question is, well, how come one of these is a great business, one of them is a decent business with some problems, and one of them is a terrible business, even though they are ostensibly the same? And for me, I look at it and I say, well, you have to go and look at the actual mechanism of action. What are the decisions that are people making underneath? And the key difference for me is that in the case of Airbnb, you have transactions which are high value transactions measured in the hundreds of dollars. And they are high consideration transactions because you don't just take the first thing that you see. And they are highly differentiated transactions because each apartment is different. So all of those things mean that there is a really strong network effect. And even after you get to a certain level of scale, more scale helps and makes the network more valuable. If you take a look at Uber, you're taking a major step backwards along all those dimensions. The value of the transaction is down in the tens of dollars. The level of consideration is minimal to zero. I often ask people, have you ever looked at the photo of an Uber driver and said, not this guy? Probably not. Right? So there is no consideration being given other than, okay, am I going to turn on Uber now or not? And then finally, there's really no differentiation. I mean, I have never bothered to go through and read the Uber ratings of the person to find out if the car was clean, and I just assume it's fine. It's going to get me from point A to point B. But there is enough of a network effect in the sense that they have to go into a particular market. Again, it's a local network, not a global one, but a local one.
Which is very different from Airbnb.
Yes, and Airbnb still has local characteristics, but the thing is travelers travel from place to place. And so there becomes a global network effect as well. With Uber, you have this local network effect, but the local network effect its effect peters out after a certain point. Once you get to critical scale, anybody else who gets to critical scale can also be there. So it's not exclusive. And so there's Uber and Lyft in US markets. And then in other markets, Uber is competing with other ride-hailing services. And at the end of the day, it supports an oligopoly, which means the profits are competed away. And then, of course, you get down to the next level, you have the Limes and Birds of the world, and it's even worse because they all looked at it and said, wow, this is great. We can create an Uber-like situation using bikes and scooters. We don't have to deal with the messy business of recruiting drivers and putting up with drivers who might behave badly and all that sort of thing. We just have this clean, simple hardware, and it's really easy. We just have to raise some money, spend a couple $1 million on Chinese hardware, and throw them on the streets. And the problem with that is that, of course, everyone else can do it as well. And if you think about the actual principles behind it, we're talking about minimally valuable transactions measured in single-digit dollars. We're talking about literally no differentiation. Every piece of hardware is the same. And we're talking about zero consideration. So it should come as no surprise that there's no differentiation, there's no true network effect, and as a result, these businesses are miserable failures.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I think is interesting though is, and I mean, you both have been knocking around the world of entrepreneurship for a long time, is, and I went through this in the late 90s, right? I was an entrepreneurship professor back then. And back then, all you had to do was say, well, my business has a .com behind it, and so I have a business model, and you'd raise like millions of dollars. And I'm out there saying, keep costs variable, don't spend before you have, get sales before you have.
And people are saying, what's wrong with you, teen Professor Rita McGrath? I mean, this is insane. This is a new economy. I mean, you're a teenager. You should understand this.
Exactly. I mean, it was like, God. And so of course the .com bust happened, and I would like to think I did not spend too much time saying I told you so, but I kind of feel like the last maybe 8-10 years I've been in that moment again, which is so much money, and it's really, I think, almost distorting the entrepreneurial values that we have, which is, you have a good idea, you test proof of concept, you conserve resources, except in a blitzscaling kind of mode. But like, people are just throwing money at this stuff. And I just wonder, where do we see this? Are we in a new world? Is this how it's going to be forever, where all this money is just chasing any crazy idea? Or will this eventually be like a .com post-mortem kind of thing?
Well, as I said, dating back to the .com era, and this is something that I'm not alone in saying, but like, anytime someone says, this time it's different, or everything has changed, reach for your wallet and protect it, because bad things are coming. So the difference, of course, today is that these companies have real value, right? They're not just being purely valued on the future prospect of their eyeballs will be valuable someday, but they are actually doing useful things. I've been a skeptic of DoorDash because I fundamentally believe that business model is not a particularly good business model, but it no doubt does serve a useful purpose. I just don't think it's going to be a great business, although I do admire the work of execution the team there has done. And so all these things, like DoorDash, I may think it's not a great business, but it's not like Chemdex, where it went public with a market cap of $2 billion on trailing revenues of 300,000. So there's a huge difference between where we stand today and where we were back in those terrifying .com days. That being said, I do think that the money distorts things. And I think we see the symptoms in things like WeWork, where you have all this money flooding in, you have a founder who is out of control, you have investors who are unable to rein that founder in because they fear being cut out and not being able to cash in. And I think that, it is in a microcosm similar to what we've seen, to take it all the way back to the beginning of this conversation and the events of the past few days. There is a conservative commentator named Ross Douthat. I don't know how to properly pronounce his name, but he coined the term dream politique as opposed to realpolitik, which is the basis of politics of fantasy. And we are sometimes, in some cases, seeing the business of fantasy, where people say, if I just believe it hard enough, then it's going to be okay. Well, the answer is no. Now, you can still succeed and thrive during this time, and that's by doing what you and I have advocated, which is to think about the underlying principles, think about the actual business going on. It doesn't matter if everyone around you is going crazy. You can still do things the right way. And I often remind people of the example of Chuck Prince, who is the CEO of Citigroup, right before the entire meltdown of the subprime mortgages. And somebody asked Chuck, Citigroup came in late and went in heavily into subprime mortgages. And somebody asked him, why are you doing this? He said, when the music's playing, you got to dance. And my response to that is, your job as CEO is to make decisions, not act like you just got to do what everyone else is doing. And no surprise, he lost his job shortly thereafter.
I remember that. In fact, I think I've used that as an example in class. So,
Rita,
yeah.
Coming back from Europe, I note a lot of what you and Chris are describing as so many ecosystems try to replicate the success of Silicon Valley. They try to build the building blocks of the technology economy, and that often includes their local chapter of NASDAQ and trying to make public market capital available to startups, trying to strongly encourage or arm twist even pension funds, institutionals, foundations and other actors to invest in the innovation economy, and to do so with a spirit of let's help the local team succeed. Our economy, our country, it reminds me of the same way that second tier cities who are pining to have an NBA franchise, often push and cite all the reasons why you really need them, even though there's plenty of examples to the contrary that maybe it doesn't actually work out well for the taxpayer in the community. It's that same kind of national pride that I see happening in an irrational fashion. And of course, once the NASDAQ, and I don't mean any criticism here, that's the business they're in, but once there is a technology listing, then there have to be companies to put on it. And so now you begin to look for, well, which are the best candidates? And it may be that none of them are appropriate candidates for an IPO, but because you now need some, you're going to go ahead and take the best ones that are available and put them up. And in places with less sophisticated investor populations, they haven't had that 20-year period to learn from the dot-com era like investors in America did. And so what I see coming in the near future is kind of a repeat of the dot-com era in other markets as IPOs are set forth, and less sophisticated investors who haven't had the opportunity to see close and firsthand what's happened in American markets, who lack access through their own networks to people like Chris and Reed and the things that they write about, making those same mistakes again. But for all the positional reasons as Chris describes.
That's really interesting. And, a wag once said to me, well, the only place in the world that doesn't want to become Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley. And there's been like mountains of papers spilled on what makes it so special. But I think your point is well taken, which is it's not one thing, right? It's a complex ecosystem of interrelated parts, and very difficult to sort of pull one out and say, that's it, right? That's the silver bullet. So a couple of questions about what can you give us any examples of great distribution?
So this is I saw that in the chat and I was waiting for this question. So there are a couple of incredible examples. And again, it doesn't have to be unique distribution, although that's great if you can manage it. It just has to be differentiated. So a great example that just had an excellent outcome is Slack. So Slack is a tool which obviously is an enterprise software tool. It ultimately makes its money selling to different companies, but it was able to build something that is rare in the enterprise space, which is a freemium model, and a freemium model with a very brilliant freemium metric. So with Slack, for those of you who are unfamiliar, although I think most people are, you can adopt Slack and set up a team for free. And the key freemium metric is not number of users or anything like that. They want to let people go ahead and grow as quickly as possible and spread like kudzu. But what they have is a limit on 10,000 messages that are going to be stored and visible. And so what happens is you start using it, and then at the end of the day, you start, oh my God, the old messages are disappearing. I can't possibly have this. I have to go ahead and buy it. And so, of course, Slack grew enormously quickly, was very successful, and ultimately was just sold, I believe, to Salesforce.com for the single largest software sale of all time, just narrowly edging out LinkedIn, which for a long time was the biggest software acquisition of all time. So that's a great example of how differentiated distribution can be a huge benefit. The irony, of course, is that Microsoft's Teams has in turn come and taken a huge bite out of Slack's business, and that's because Microsoft has always controlled distribution. Microsoft has created this incredible account control, and as a result, Teams rides internally as a blitzscaling venture at Microsoft on Microsoft's distribution power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing Microsoft has done, which Jeff Moore and I were talking about in a fireside chat some time ago, is they're really good at equivalent innovation.
Mm-hmm.
So, PowerPoint may not be the best presentation software ever, but it's good enough.
Right.
Excel probably isn't the best spreadsheet ever, but it's good enough. And because they've got that distribution, people go along for the ride, right? So
precisely. I mean, if you think about it, again, it's not enough that it's good enough. That's part of it. The other thing is that Microsoft's distribution powers allows them to make it the standard.
Yeah.
And so it's the combination of it's good enough and it's the standard that gets people to just say, screw it, I'm just going to use it.
Exactly.
And that's something that Microsoft has been doing for decades now. And again, anybody could copy it, but it's hard to do if you don't have that market power.
Exactly. So we're coming up in the end of our time, which this flew by. So how do people learn more? Where would you direct them if they want to become part of the Global Scaling Academy? And by the way, for those of you putting comments in, if we don't get to your comment, we'll follow up after this. So where should people go? How do they learn more? So they've got to buy the books, of course, promo opportunity again.
Absolutely. But Jeff, why don't you point, I put the links in earlier while you were talking, but why don't you return and talk about them for a second?
Yes, just to note that Chris did put the blitzscalabilitygrader.com tool into the chat, and that's a simple tool that allows you to self-assess any business, whether it be a startup business or an internal corporate venture, based on the blitzscaling principles, and get some quick directional feedback about the strength of your scalability and whether or not blitzscaling is an attractive option for you. Inside the community, which is globalscalingacademy.com, it's a mouthful, but again, globalscalingacademy.com. There you see an explanation of how we have applied blitzscaling to the startup world, the corporate world, and to investors. And just a quick example, you may say, well, how do all of those groups have something in common? And it's very simple. Those are the three groups that come together to collaborate on scaling almost any venture. So whether you're the startup founder or you're the innovation team or entrepreneurs in residence at a corporation, or the investor or corporate venture capitalist, you at some point are playing a role in attempting to decide who to partner with, decide what to invest in, or in the case of the founder, decide how to scale the business. And so we've attempted to use blitzscaling as a common vocabulary that brings everyone together around these core points of scalability and to begin a conversation that allows them to increase their own ability to add value across their organizations and ultimately to solve the problems that they're facing. So that's the work that we're doing and how blitzscaling plays a central role in it.
Wonderful. And I'll just also mention for all the millionaires and billionaires who happen to be on the call right now, we are about to hold our first close of Blitzscaling Ventures, the venture fund that invests in the most blitzscalable companies in the world. So again, millionaires and billionaires, reach out to us.
I'll make sure to make that point. And I'm really hopeful that we are at a bit of a turning point with our whole kind of social contract going forward that will make it a more fertile and accessible way for entrepreneurs from all over to really get their businesses started and move forward. So thank you for all the work that you guys do, and to be continued. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Rita. Huge honor to be on this series. I know you and I have talked about this series for some time. I've been watching its growth with great interest and enthusiasm, and it's just great to be on it.
Great. Well, thanks so much. And here's to 2021.
It could not be worse. Hopefully, it's going to be a great year. I'm actually on record as saying that as the vaccines roll out, we are going to see a massive rebound. All the things that people have missed, they're going to go back to. Travel is going to explode. Restaurants are going to explode. It's going to be amazing. We just have to hold on a little bit longer and get there.
From your mouth. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.